April 16, 1945. The southern ridge of Okinawa's Ayashima. Staff Sergeant Thomas McFatter of the 52nd Defense Battalion wiped sweat from his brow as he stared at the impossible scene below. What had begun as an unauthorized defensive innovation by his 12-man squad had just transformed into something unprecedented in the Pacific Theater. Below him, over 300 Japanese soldiers were retreating in disarray, abandoning their planned assault on the American airfield. The 26-year-old black Marine from North Carolina watched as the enemy forces stumbled through the elaborate trap his men had secretly constructed over 3 nights of forbidden excursions beyond their assigned perimeter. "Sir," whispered Corporal James Wilson beside him, "they're running straight into the secondary triggers." McFatter nodded silently as the first of the cleverly disguised tripwires activated, sending cascades of illumination flares skyward and revealing the full Japanese formation to waiting American artillery observers. What McFatter and his squad had accomplished that morning defied nearly 2 centuries of military doctrine and 4 years of rigid racial segregation policies. A single squad of black Marines, officially restricted to non-combat roles, had just reversed the momentum of a major Japanese offensive through improvisation their white commanders would have immediately forbidden had they known. As the distinctive crump of naval artillery began to rain down on the exposed enemy formation, McFatter allowed himself a brief smile. "Command's going to have to decide if they're court-martialing us or decorating us," he murmured. The answer would prove more complicated than anyone could have predicted. The war in the Pacific by spring of 1945 represented a study in contradictions for America's black servicemen. Despite President Roosevelt's executive order 8801 prohibiting racial discrimination in defense industries, the armed forces remained strictly segregated. Black Marines in particular occupied a precarious position within the Corps. Not until 1942 had the first black recruits been accepted for training at Montford Point, a segregated facility near Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Unlike their white counterparts who trained at the storied Parris Island, these pioneers entered a Marine Corps that had remained exclusively white since its founding in 1775. The roughly 20,000 black Marines who served during World War II were predominantly assigned to ammunition supply units, depot companies and defense battalions, unloading supplies, constructing facilities, and managing ammunition to close with and destroy the enemy. The Japanese forces on Okinawa presented a stark contrast to American segregation policies. The Imperial Japanese Army operated with a unified command structure that incorporated soldiers from across their conquered territories. While Japanese racial ideology positioned them as superior to other Asian peoples, their military necessity had forced practical integration of Korean, Taiwanese, and Okinawan conscripts within their fighting units. By 1945, the Japanese High Command had abandoned many of its earlier prejudices in the desperate effort to halt the American advance toward their home islands. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding Japanese forces on Okinawa, had explicitly ordered his commanders to utilize all available manpower regardless of origin. This pragmatic approach stood in marked contrast to American units that deliberately sidelined thousands of willing fighters based solely on race. The statistics told a damning story. While approximately 1 million black Americans served in the armed forces during World War II, less than 1% received the opportunity for combat assignments. The segregated military maintained separate facilities, separate units, and unequal training opportunities that systematically disadvantaged black servicemen. Yet, paradoxically, America portrayed itself as fighting for democracy and freedom against fascist ideologies explicitly based on racial supremacy. This contradiction did not escape the Black Marines of the 52nd Defense Battalion. Private First Class Nathan Hodges, a former school teacher from Georgia who served under McFatter, kept a journal throughout his deployment. His entry from March 12, 1945, captured this tension. "We stand guard over supplies while others fight the enemy." We secure areas already won while others advance. We are Marines in name, but laborers in practice. The enemy we're supposedly inferior to fight has no such reservations about who carries a rifle. This sentiment echoed throughout the battalion, creating a quiet determination to prove their worth should the opportunity arise. The opportunity began taking shape on April 13, 1945, 3 days before the Japanese attack. Corporal James Wilson, a former hunting guide from Louisiana serving as McFadder's squad leader, had been conducting an unauthorized reconnaissance of the ridgeline approximately 800 yards beyond their assigned perimeter. Such excursions violated standing orders that restricted Black Marine movements to designated areas. But Wilson had been slipping beyond the perimeter for weeks, mapping terrain features and observing Japanese patrol patterns. What he discovered that evening changed everything. "Sarge, they're massing for something big," Wilson reported after returning to McFadder's position shortly after midnight. "I counted at least 300 moving into assembly areas behind the eastern slope. They're bringing up mortars, machine guns, the works." Standard procedure would have required McFadder to immediately report this intelligence to battalion command, but experience had taught the squad a bitter lesson about how such reports from Black Marines were typically received. "Last time we reported movement, Captain Lawson said we were imagining things and doubled our work detail as punishment," McFadder later recalled in a 1977 interview. "We had information that could save lives, and no way to make them take it seriously." Faced with this dilemma, McFadder made a decision that would later be described as either brilliant insubordination or reckless endangerment, depending on who was doing the describing. "If they won't let us fight alongside them, we'll fight ahead of them," he told his assembled squad in the pre-dawn hours of April 14th. What followed was an extraordinary 3-night operation conducted in complete secrecy from their own command structure. McFadder divided his 12 men into 4 3-man teams. Using their assigned maintenance duties as cover, they gradually accumulated materials that would normally never be accessible to a Black Marine unit: trip flares from the airfield perimeter supplies, ammunition from their handling duties, communication wire from repair stockpiles, and even several cases of white phosphorus grenades that were accidentally damaged in transport and marked for disposal. Each night, the teams would slip beyond the perimeter under cover of darkness, working systematically to transform the likely Japanese approach routes into what Corporal Wilson described as a hunter's paradise. Their familiarity with the terrain from Wilson's reconnaissance proved invaluable as they established interlocking fields of fire, camouflaged firing positions, and most importantly, an elaborate early warning system designed to both alert American forces and confuse attacking. Japanese units. Private First Class Marcus Green, who had worked as an electrician in Philadelphia before the war, designed the core of their defensive innovation. Using communication wire and salvaged batteries, he created what the squad called electric trip flares, knowledge they had accumulated through careful observation, despite being officially excluded from combat operations. The labor was exhausting and dangerous. The men worked through 3 consecutive nights while still performing their regular duties during daylight hours. Private Henry Jefferson nearly stepped on a Japanese mine while placing one of the final trigger mechanisms. Corporal Wilson suffered a serious cut requiring 20 stitches when communication wire snapped under tension, but the squad's medic, Private First Class William Tate, treated the wound in secret rather than risk exposing their unauthorized operation. By the pre-dawn hours of April 16th, they had transformed approximately 2 square miles of approach terrain into what McFadder called a combat multiplier, who had worked as a radio operator at a commercial station in Detroit before the war, accessing fire support that would normally never be authorized based on intelligence from Black Marines. As the Japanese main force reached the midpoint of the approach route, McFadder gave the signal to activate the main trap sequence. Private Robert Johnson, concealed in a position approximately 300 yards from the Japanese flank, connected the final circuit that would initiate the full sequence. What followed was described by multiple witnesses as resembling the 4th of July, a thunderstorm, and a warehouse explosion all at once. The carefully sequenced illumination flares activated in waves, starting behind the Japanese formation and progressively moving forward, creating the impression of an American force closing from behind. Simultaneously, the white phosphorus grenades positioned along the flanking routes detonated, creating both a physical barrier and the appearance of artillery already landing. The Japanese force, suddenly illuminated and apparently surrounded, reacted exactly as McPhatter had anticipated. A strategically crucial installation, he classified details of the operation while creating an alternative narrative that could be officially recognized. The official account that emerged described McPhatter's squad as responding to an unexpected enemy probe, rather than initiating a planned defensive operation. Their actions were characterized as appropriate defensive measures rather than an elaborate pre-planned trap. Most significantly, the report emphasized their proper coordination with supporting arms, rather than acknowledging the unauthorized communications and independent decision-making that had actually occurred. This sanitized version allowed Wallace to award Bronze Stars to McPhatter and Wilson, with Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medals for the rest of the squad. There's a pride that wasn't there before. We're still loading their ammunition, but they know we can fight. This change in perception extended beyond social interactions to subtle shifts in operational practice. Battalion commanders began positioning Black Marine units in more tactically significant locations, though always with the official justification of logistical necessity rather than combat effectiveness. For the Japanese forces on Okinawa, the failed attack represented a significant setback in their defense strategy. The Imperial Japanese Army had committed substantial resources to the planned assault on Ieshima, viewing the airfield as a critical target whose destruction would hamper American air support for ground operations on Okinawa proper. The comprehensive failure of the attack forced Japanese commanders to reassess their approach. A report dated April 20, 1945, from Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, the 32nd Army senior staff officer, described the engagement as demonstrating unexpected American tactical sophistication and recommended increased caution when approaching apparently lightly defended sectors. The irony that this elite American unit was in fact a single squad of Marines officially restricted from combat operations due to their race would not become apparent until after the war. Intelligence reports captured after the war revealed that the Japanese 32nd Army Command initially believed they had encountered an elite American unit employing new tactics specifically developed for Pacific Island warfare. The weeks following the April 16th engagement saw a marked increase in combat participation by elements of the 52nd Defense Battalion, though always carefully characterized as defensive operations or perimeter security in official documentation. McPhatter's squad, now informally designated as a Special Security Team, conducted 3 additional operations against Japanese positions, including a night reconnaissance that provided critical intelligence for a subsequent Army attack. These expanded roles remained technically within the constraints of segregation policy, while practically demonstrating the combat capabilities of Black Marines. General Wallace, walking a careful line between military effectiveness and institutional policy, authorized these missions through a chain of verbal orders that left minimal documentary evidence, the euphemism adopted for integrated defensive positions. This data, while never formally published during the war, circulated among senior officers and eventually contributed to the case for integration made by Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, in 1947. The experiences of individual Japanese soldiers who encountered McPhatter's trap provided perhaps the most ironic dimension of the entire episode. Sergeant Toshiro Yamamoto, captured 3 days after the failed attack, expressed shock during interrogation when he learned that American forces included Black soldiers. "We were told Americans would not arm their Negro population because they feared them," he stated through an interpreter. "Our officers said they were used only as laborers." This misconception, deliberately fostered by Japanese propaganda, had created a dangerous blind spot in Japanese tactical planning. When confronted with evidence that Black Americans were not only armed but capable of sophisticated combat operations, Japanese commanders were forced to abandon a fundamental assumption that had informed their psychological warfare strategy. For McPhatter's men, the most profound change came in their own self-perception. Private First Class Calvin Morris, whose radio communication had been crucial to the operation's success, later described this transformation. "Before Iwo we were Marines who happened to be Black. After that night, we were just Marines from segregated support personnel to combat Marines who had happened to be segregated, all skills officially considered unnecessary for their assigned duties." Battalion officers, while never formally acknowledging this training, adjusted duty rotations to create spaces where it could occur without disrupting required work. This tacit support represented a quiet rebellion against segregation policies by mid-level officers who had witnessed the practical benefits of utilizing all available personnel regardless of race. On the strategic level, the successful defense of Iwo Airfield had consequences far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The airfield remained operational throughout the critical phases of the Okinawa campaign, providing vital close air support for ground operations. Army Air Corps P-51 Mustangs operating from Iwo conducted more than 3,000 sorties against Japanese positions on Okinawa proper, while artillery spotting aircraft coordinated naval gunfire that proved decisive in breaking several major Japanese defensive lines. Had the April 16th attack succeeded in damaging or temporarily closing the airfield, military historians estimate that the Okinawa campaign might have extended by weeks or even months, with corresponding increases in American casualties. The men of McPhatter's squad, therefore, not only saved lives directly through their action, but indirectly preserved thousands more through the continued operation of the airfield. The broader statistical impact of Black Marine contributions on Okinawa presented military leadership with uncomfortable data that contradicted prevailing racial assumptions. By the campaign's conclusion, Black Marine units that had been permitted even limited combat roles demonstrated efficiency and effectiveness rates comparable to or exceeding those of white units with similar experience levels. A classified assessment prepared for Marine Commandant Alexander Vandegrift in July 1945 noted that non-traditional deployment of certain elements has yielded unexpectedly positive results, warranting further investigation. This carefully worded acknowledgment of Black combat effectiveness represented a significant, if cautious, shift in institutional perspective. For individual Marines like Corporal Wilson, whose reconnaissance had first identified the Japanese buildup, the experience provided validation that transcended official recognition. "We proved what we always knew," he wrote to his mother in a letter dated May 3, 1945. "Give us the same chance, and we'll fight just as hard and just as smart as anybody else. Maybe smarter because we've got more to prove." This sentiment echoed throughout the 52nd Defense Battalion as word of McPhatter's operation spread, inspiring similar initiatives by other Black Marines seeking to demonstrate their capabilities despite institutional restrictions. The psychological impact on Japanese forces facing American units after mid-April 1945 revealed another unexpected consequence of McPhatter's operation. Japanese intelligence, attempting to make sense of the failed attack, had incorrectly concluded that the Americans were deploying specialized night fighting units with advanced tactical training. This misinterpretation led to increased caution in Japanese night operations across the Okinawa theater, reducing the frequency and intensity of night attacks that had previously been a signature of Japanese infantry tactics. Colonel Yahara's personal diary, recovered after the war, noted on April 25th, "American night defenses have improved dramatically. They seem to anticipate our movements before they begin. This assessment, based partly on the Ayashima experience, contributed to the Japanese decision to rely more heavily on fixed defenses rather than mobile operations, nothing in writing, nothing on the record. This shadow recognition created a cognitive dissonance that many black Marines of the era described as more challenging than outright discrimination. They were simultaneously essential and invisible, capable and restricted, respected and segregated. The experiences of the black Marines on Okinawa directly influenced post-war efforts to desegregate the American military. Several officers who witnessed the effectiveness of black units in combat roles became advocates for integration, including Lieutenant Covington, who submitted a formal recommendation for policy review before leaving active service in 1946. More significantly, the statistical data gathered during the Okinawa campaign provided empirical evidence that contradicted claims of black unsuitability for combat operations. When President Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, officially desegregating the armed forces, the decision was supported by a substantial body of practical experience demonstrating that integration enhanced rather than diminished military effectiveness. For the men of McFadder's squad, the post-war period brought diverse experiences that reflected the changing racial landscape of America. Staff Sergeant McFadder remained in the Marine Corps through the official integration process, eventually retiring as a Master Gunnery Sergeant in 1967 after serving in Korea and the early phases of Vietnam. Corporal Wilson returned to Louisiana and became active in civil rights organizing, frequently citing his military experience as evidence against segregation. They said we couldn't fight, but when the chips were down, they sure wanted us fighting for them. Private First Class Morris used his GI Bill benefits to complete an electrical engineering degree and joined the growing aviation industry in California, becoming one of the first black engineers hired by Lockheed in 1953. Each carried the experience of Ishima as both validation of their capabilities and evidence of the arbitrary nature of racial restrictions. The legacy of the April 16th action extended well beyond the individuals directly involved. When the Marine Corps officially integrated its combat units in 1949, the transition was facilitated by the experiences and informal training that had emerged from episodes like McFadder's operation. Black Marines who had secretly developed combat skills during the war became valued instructors and leaders, helping to smooth a process that many had predicted would be disruptive and difficult. The tactical innovations developed by McFadder's squad were incorporated into standard Marine Corps defensive doctrines, though without attribution to their originators. A 1952 Marine Corps Field Manual on Perimeter Defense included diagrams remarkably similar to the system employed on Ie Shima, described simply as lessons learned from Pacific operations. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact emerged through the personal connections formed during and after the Okinawa campaign. Lieutenant Covington maintained correspondence with McFadder throughout the post-war period, and when Covington later served as an administrator in the Department of the Navy during the 1950s, he helped ensure that the contributions of black Marines were included in official histories of the Pacific campaigns. Similarly, General Wallace, who had navigated the complex politics of recognizing McFadder's squad without challenging segregation policies, became an internal advocate for integration after the war, telling a gathering of senior officers in 1947 that artificial restrictions on combat assignments represent an unacceptable waste of human potential in future conflicts. The statistical evidence from Okinawa continued to inform military policy long after the immediate post-war integration process. A 1954 study commissioned by the Department of Defense examining combat effectiveness in the Korean War made specific reference to the Okinawa experience, noting that previous evidence of successful integration during World War II operations, particularly in the Pacific Theater, predicted the positive outcomes observed in Korea. This institutional memory helped sustain integration policies through periods of social backlash against civil rights advancements in civilian society, creating a situation where the American military, once a bastion of formalized segregation, eventually became one of the nation's most successfully integrated institutions. For Japanese veterans who learned the full story after the war, the Yaeshima experience offered a different kind of lesson. Toshiro Yamamoto, the sergeant captured after the failed attack who had expressed shock at learning of Black American combat personnel, returned to Japan and eventually became a history teacher. In his memoir published in 1972, he wrote, "The most valuable lesson of war is discovering that your most fundamental assumptions are often completely wrong. We believed Americans would not trust their Negro citizens with weapons, and we built strategies around this belief. One night on a small island showed how wrong we were and how dangerous such assumptions can be." This recognition of how racial assumptions had created strategic vulnerabilities became part of post-war Japanese military analysis, informing their approach to international relations and defense planning in subsequent decades. The transformation of individual Black Marines who participated in combat operations on Okinawa revealed the profound psychological impact of being allowed to fulfill their potential after facing systematic restriction. Private First Class Hodges, the former schoolteacher whose journal documented the experience, returned to education after the war and eventually became a principal in Atlanta's public school system. He frequently told his students, "The difference between what people think you can do and what you can actually do is often just the opportunity to try." This philosophy, forged in the contradiction between official limitation and practical achievement on Okinawa, informed his approach to education in a still segregated South, where he worked to create opportunities for Black students to demonstrate capabilities that the system often failed to recognize. The story of McFatter's squad eventually found its way into military educational curricula, though often in forms that downplayed its racial significance. By the 1970s, the operation was being taught in Marine Corps tactical schools as an example of effective small unit initiative and innovative defensive planning. Only in the 1990s, as the military embraced a more comprehensive approach to its own racial history, did the full context of the operation become part of official training materials. A 1997 Marine Corps historical publication finally acknowledged what had long been known unofficially. The actions of Black Marines on Aishima demonstrated not only tactical proficiency, but the fundamental fallacy of segregation policies that wasted combat potential based on racial categorization. For Thomas McFatter, the most meaningful recognition came not from official decorations, but from the changed attitudes of fellow Marines. "And after Aishima, white Marines started treating us like we belonged," he recalled in a 1983 interview. "Not all of them, and not right away, but enough that you could feel the difference. They'd come to our areas to talk tactics, ask advice, share cigarettes. That meant more than any medal they could have given us." This ground-level integration, soldiers recognizing each other's capabilities regardless of race, represented the real transformation that official policies would later formalize and extend. It began with demonstrated competence in combat actions like setting an illegal trap that turned a Japanese advance into a retreat on a small island west of Okinawa in April 1945.